All right. Thank you. Um, Thank you all again for coming. Today we are super happy to have Dr. Flood here talking about African-centered industrial and organizational psychology. Dr. Flood has a PhD in industrial and organizational psychology, and he is currently an assistant professor and the school advisor for the Association of Black Psychologists at Bethune-Cookman University. Dr. Flood is currently working on several psychology textbooks on African-centered psychology and African-centered industrial and organizational psychology, and co-wrote and also produced a documentary called Dads and Breastfeeding, the official guide for new fathers. He is also the co-founder of an African American debate league called the Great Debate League and the Citizens for a Sustainable Future, a nonprofit action-oriented think tank. We're very excited to introduce him to you today, and I turn it over to Dr. Flood to start his presentation.
Hello, everybody. How y'all doing today?
Good.
Yeah, good. All right. All right. So I'm gonna hop into it. Um, this I don't want it to be that much of a lecture. Yeah, I do that. That's my full-time job as a professor. So if you have questions as I'm going through this, I, I welcome the questions. Or we can just have all the questions at the end of the presentation. Um, Either way is fine with me. I'm pretty much good with it either way. But this particular topic is near and dear to me as I have, a PhD in IL psychology. I also am heavily into what is called African-centered psychology. So this presentation is going to sort of bridge the gap between these two fields of psychology. And my forthcoming book will be titled African-Centered Industrial Organizational Psychology, Work and Organizations in the African American Context. So let's hop on in. Let me put myself out there. Let's see. All right. So what are the learning objectives in this presentation? Real quickly, I'm going to go over what African-centered or Afrocentricity means, the differences between African-centered and European worldview and psychology, go over some African-centered research methods, personality theories, and assessments, what an African-centered organization is or would look like, the training and development, and organizational development and change. Now, I can't go as deeply as I would in the book, so these are just broad kind of brushes to get the appetite whet for what's to come, which will be more comprehensive, right? And we'll go through some questions, and I have other stuff if we have time. I don't know if we'll get to that, but if we do, we can look at those slides as well. And so let's get into it. All right, first, in the African orientation or worldview, before you start anything like this, we want to give a dedication to the elders and the ancestors. And so my work, and is fundamentally informed by the list of people that I have on this slide. So the first is Dr. Nzinga Warfield Kapak. She passed on a minute ago. And this one is a dissertation and one is an article that she wrote. The other one is Dr. Jerome Skelly. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. Hopefully it's not wrong. He's an elder. And this is his book, Human Services in the Afrocentric Paradigm. And then another really influential book is Understanding Organization Through Culture and Structure by the list of elders on that bullet point. All right. So this is a new field that I'm sort of creating. So what does it draw from? Well, it draws from a lot of different areas. Just like IO psychology drew from, organizational behavior, it drew from anthropology, etc. African-centered IO psychology draws from obviously IO psychology, but also from African-centered psychology, from African-centered social work and sociology, from industrial sociology, which a lot of that there's a hard line of demarcation between industrial sociology and the topics they cover and what IO psychology covers. And some of the information in industrial sociology is very, very important to fully kind of understanding what's going on in IO psychology. So there's a lot of that in here as well. There's community psychology, there's Marxist psychology, there's Pan-Africanism, Black nationalism, and finally, there's Africana studies. So, what do I mean when I talk about African-centered or Afrocentricity? Basically, I mean, this was a really hot topic in the mid to late 80s and early 90s. It kind of lost its flavor by the early 2000s. Um, but when I'm talking about African-centered or Afrocentricity, I mean, using your point of analysis as a social scientist from the perspective, from the culture, from the worldview of African people. That means Africans in the mainland or throughout the diaspora, wherever Africans may find themselves on the planet Earth or even outside Earth. All right. Um, that's a really important thing because this is African-centered perspectives are needed due to the countervailing forces of what we would call Eurocentrism, or putting Europeans and European culture and worldview as the focal point of analysis throughout all of the social sciences and the arts, which has been sort of the standardized view is the Eurocentric view of the world and reality and culture and science and art. All right. And so African centered kind of um, discuss, hey, well, if we're going to talk about Black people, we need to talk about Black people from our own perspective. Does that make sense? Yes, no, maybe so. No need to be quiet. Yeah.
It is actually, this is very, very timely and something that I noticed was glaringly missing in my starting my first semester of IO psychology. So thank
Oh,
you.
oh yeah. Yeah, I kind of noticed that too. Way back when. All right. So let's continue. So first, in order to talk about African-centered IELTS psychology, I have to go a little bit into um, African-centered psychology is. And so we got to talk about the differences between African-centered worldview and European worldview and how that informs the psychology that we know today that we all learned in school, which is standard psychology, which I kind of call European American or European American psychology, which has its benefits, but then also has its drawbacks. So first, we have to go over the culture of African people in the mainland before colonization, imperialism, the Maafa, things of that nature. Um, Due to the environment, how we evolved, there were a lot of different cultural perspectives that differentiate African, the African ideas about reality in the world and European ideas about the world. So some things that are pretty glaring, I'm going to go over all this, but succession, right? Who gets what when the parents or the guardians pass on? Right? In the African sense of things, all right, it goes through the mother's line, all right. So the mother's brother, maybe the uncle, would get something, or those children would be heirs to the throne, or things of that nature. Whereas in the European cradle or the European worldview, it all falls from the father, from the patrilineal side. Another one would be like dowry, right? Who brings dowry to the wedding, right? We know what it is, in the American context, the woman's family brings the dowry, but there's a real reason for that, and that's because in the European society, the women's family was bringing the dowry because the woman was seen as um, someone who would bring sort of hardship. There's an extra mouth to feed. So if I'm gonna take this quote unquote problem off your hands, I need you to bring the dowry. Whereas in the African sense of things, the man is bringing the dowry because the woman is the prize. She could have children, and your line will succeed to the next generation. All right. We tend to bury our people, whereas Europeans tend to cremate them. All right. Um, we have, in the African sense, a real large value for children, right? All children. Whereas there has been, different cases in different European societies where excess babies have been killed due to environmental and resource constraints. And so these are just some of these kind of worldview or kind of cultural differences. I'm going to go more into it, but this is from what's called Cheikh Anta Diop's a Senegalese master teacher. His idea was called the two cradle theory of African and European worldviews. Um, so what is a world? I've been saying worldview, but what is a worldview kind of comprised of? All right. Well, there's four parts. There's what's called cosmology, epistemology, axiology, and ontology. And when I talk about cosmology, for African people, right, um, what we're talking about is interdependence. Not that you're independent or you're dependent, but reality is an interdependent thing. You rely on others and they rely on you. All right. Which leads into a more of a collectivist kind of idea of the world. All right. And in the African sense, humans and nature aren't separated, right? We are all a part of nature. We're not outside of nature. I know it might seem like that because we go to our house and our home and we have all this technology, but we are also in nature and a part of nature. We're not outside of nature, and so there's a human nature kind of oneness, unity. Whereas if you look at on the European side, instead of being interdependent, the prevailing or the dominant view is separateness and alienation and independence. And we'll talk more about that independence later on. And there is what's called a human nature kind of conflict, whereas man is there to battle nature and win over and master nature. Whereas in the African idea of things, there's a synthesis, there's a connection point between African people and nature. All right. And so let's go to epistemology. All right. In epistemology, for the African people, there is the affective side, right? Feelings, right? Emotions. And there's the cognitive side, thoughts, rationality, judgment, etc. And those two come together. Those two are synthesized into a larger kind of way of knowing reality. Whereas in the European sense, what dominates is the rational side of things over the feelings and emotions. And we as African people have ingested this so much so that if you see like any of those weird um what do we call those podcasts, those dating podcasts, where you'll always hear, and most of y'all hear seem to be women, that feelings are less than being rational. All right. You hear that all the time. It's a sexist trope. All right. But it's out there. That's because these African people are following the European kind of worldview. All right. The third part of worldview is what's called axiology. It's a fancy word for the value system. So the emphasis in the African sense is person to person, human to human relations. All right. I see you. I see, sometimes we'll say, I see the God in you or the goddess in you, right? Um, you can't tear another person down if you see them as a connection point to the divine, to the creator. All right. Whereas in the European sense, it's person to object, objectification. And a lot of people, especially women, understand this a lot more. I tell my students, have you ever, which are largely Black women, I say, have you ever been looked at by a Black man and they're not looking at you, they're looking through you and you're just an object, you're just, thighs, a face, and breast, right? That's objectification, right? That's a simple kind of way of objectification where anybody can understand that. Um, and the last part of this worldview is what's called ontology, right? And for the African people, everything comes from spirit. That is the makeup of the universe. And from the spiritual realm manifests the material realm. Well, in the European sense, everything comes from the material, right? And that predominates in our sciences to the point of if you can't see it, taste it, smell it, touch it, or hear it, it doesn't exist. Not only does it not exist, it's inferior, all right? And so this is the differences in these kind of worldviews. Now, some African societies are less what I just laid out, all right, as well as some European societies are less than what I've laid out. But on the average, on the aggregate, this is kind of what they fall into based off research. All right. And so this leads to some other kind of worldviews differences. Whereas I talked about the control and mastery over nature in European society and the oneness, I won't go over that. But it also some differences are the survival of the fittest. You hear that a lot. Um, and that's a European kind of way of looking at things. Like, hey, as long as the one who is most hardy, most acclimated to the environment, they take all the spoils, they take all the winnings, they survive. All right. Whereas in the African sense, it's survival of the group. All right. Um, Thinking like this, the control and mastery over nature, survival of the fittest, competition and individual rights, which in IO psychology, competition, I won't go into it very, very deeply, but competition is all in IO psychology and in organizations, the way it's set up, what you're trying to accomplish in organizations, et cetera. So there's a big push for people to compete, groups to compete, everyone's competing, and individual rights, which boil down to the emphasis on individualism. Whereas in the African sense, it's more of a cooperative, cooperation, collective responsibility of things. All right. Um, there's also a lot of in the European worldview oppression and aggression. Now, there's a lot of Black and white scholars who have talked about why the European culture tends to be so aggressive. A lot of them say it's psychosocial, and then other theories have said other things. But I just want you to understand that it's there. Whereas in the kind of African worldview, there's a complementarity going on, right? We're not opposite to each other; we complement each other. Man and women aren't adversaries. Man and nature aren't adversaries. They complement each other. One can't survive without the other, right? And so the psycho-behavioral modality of these worldviews falls down into if the European worldview is individualism, it's an emphasis on how am I unique? How do I separate myself from the group? All right. And that leads all these things kind of lead to a worldview that can become very white supremacist in its orientation and outcomes. Whereas the African worldview, again, uh, we emphasize the group, what is common between us, right? We can focus on, and we have a whole field of biopsychology, right, which talks about individual differences. And that was a decision largely by Europeans. What are we going to focus on as a psychology? Are we going to focus on what makes people the same? What do they have in common? Or what makes them different from each other? All right. And so that leads the African worldview to become what we would consider to be humanist or African humanist. All right. And so that's a kind of a comparative worldview um, between the two competing worldviews or the two worldviews that are out there. These are just some extra kind of differences. The optimal is closer aligns with the African worldview, whereas the suboptimal kind of aligns with the European worldview. And so things like your identity is what we would call an extended self, right? I'm connected to everyone else via spirit, right? Via spirit manifested, right? Whereas in the more European worldview or the suboptimal worldview, it's based on external criteria or individualism, right? Or, yeah, things of that nature. So I won't go into the other parts of this, but these are some other kinds of differences. Before I go on, what do you think about this? These differences between the African and European worldview?
I've been seeing that it feels like a lot of the language I've been hearing as of late from people within this space or even within the DEI space are using language that is more tied to the optimal view. And it's very clear that the current is antithetical to to that. I mean, I think I knew this, but it's like I don't think it's ever been so much in my face of realizing how much things are just at not at war with, I guess at war with each other for lack of better term.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to state that. There is a kind of a I don't want to be like these weird Trumpers. There is a sort of a culture war kind of going on, um, but not in the way that they frame it. But yeah, a lot of DEI pulls from this, but what they don't do that they pull from African-centered scholars, but they don't attribute that what they have found is from these scholars. They're not citing these sources. And a lot of the DEI books, like the Robin DiAngelo's, things of that nature, they take a lot from African scholars, but they don't explain it very well, in my opinion. And that's when you get all the kind of propaganda from, right-wing sources. Oh, they're saying everybody's racist, et cetera, et cetera, or you're a DEI hire, et cetera, et cetera.
It's
Yeah, go ahead.
interesting because just even in my own personal journey, it's been returning me to these concepts. And because I just didn't realize that, wow, like what we as a people have been has been that yeah, I didn't realize like this is who we are, but unfortunately we have been put into the society and the system that is
Yeah.
trying to condition that out of us.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm going to talk about that in some future slides. But yeah, so hold on to that one. So, what do I mean when I say psychology? All right. So, psychology, the word psychology has a long history. All right. So, Sa translates to jewel, and that's from Kemetic or the Egyptian language. All right. Um, Ki means a soul, and Su means she. So, this name was taken by the Greeks who were students in Egypt for a long period of time and renamed to the goddess that we call Psyche, right? Everyone knows Psyche, right? Um, that comes from Egypt, all right? Put together these three terms, you get Saku, which is a Kemetic or ancient Egyptian word meaning the soul, essentially the soul of the being or just the soul. We all know ology means the study of in Greek, right? And so psychology roughly means the study of the soul. Now, obviously, we know as psychologists, we don't study the soul. I mean, there is a part of psychology that does study the soul. I think it's called trans something. But largely, we're not studying the soul, we're studying the mind. So the psyche um, was about the mind. And so that's why psychology is about study of mind and of behaviors of humans, right? For the most part. But I think the history is important. Okay. So all of this that I've been talking about leads to a type of psychology. The European psychology is the standard psychology that we've all learned going through school. All right. And so that psychology, all right, is control and mastery, right? The orientation of that psychology is is going to be rank order. So things in reality are ranked, and one thing is going to be better than the other. Man is more important than women. Uh, uh, Adults are more important than children. Man is above nature. Um, and you can go down the list. Your your rational thinking of your thoughts and feelings, right? Um, it's a concentration on a focus on individualism, um, and there's a focus on materialism and reductionism or elementalism. All right, reducing things down to their very core to find out what is the the smallest portion of this particular idea or thing that we are studying, and not really putting it all together in more of a gestaltic kind of way of thinking. Whereas African psychology is about diversity. It emphasizes the spiritual or a holistic fashion, all right? Collectivism, human oneness. So the cultural focus in standard or European psychology is that the European culture and worldview is optimal, is best for all people, all right? Um, and so it's very European centered, all right? Whereas the African cultural focus in psychology is that African culture and worldview is optimal for African people, all right? And so this then leads to different psychological models, whereas in the European psychology, we talk about individual behavior. We talk about, even though they don't say this, they'll say it's standard. When we talk about European psychological functioning as the standard, they don't say it's European psychological functioning. They just say this is in general psychological function. All right. And we look for empiricism or external validation to our theories. All right. Um, so we want numbers to make things more believable, right? Whereas in African psychology, there's a cultural context for behavior. There are cultural differences in psychological function. All right. And this leads to different subject matters that are emphasized by the two different psychologies. In European psychology, there's a focus again on individual differences in behavior, all right, and European personality and deviations, all right. So European personality is the standard. It's where all of the personality theories kind of originate from. And if you deviate from those personality theories, you will be seen as having some kind of mental health concern. All right. You're not acting normal, quote unquote. All right. It's talk European psychology talks a lot about human biophysiology and individual dynamics. Whereas African psychology, again, talks about cultural differences, talks about the human spirit, culturally specific personality, and cultural dynamics. All right. And so those are the defining differences between the two psychologies. Once again, European psychology is standard psychology. And again, there are parts of European psychology that are very helpful. Um, but then there are drawbacks if you are not of European descent. Okay. All right. So let's talk about some African-centered research methods. So how do we get the data that we recruit to kind of validate what I've been talking about in the last couple of slides? I'm not going to go, there's only one slide for this, so I'm not going to go too in depth with it. I think it's important to acknowledge. So there's lots of different theories on how to go about researching African people, but they all fall under the rubric of what are called Africana studies. All right. And some of the tenets of this is that there should be a recognition of the necessity of racial cultural specificity. Again, like I said a couple of slides ago, if you're studying Black people or African people, you need to study them from their own perspective. Otherwise, you're going to get some very weird outcomes in your interpretation of your data. All right. Um, it is a prioritization of African needs and interests. All right. It focuses on collective emancipation and empowerment. A lot of times, researchers are just studying differences between cultures. And when they find those differences, they leave it at that. They're not there to actually help improve upon things that may be damaging due to oppression or cultural oppression, things of that nature. Uh, it focuses on giving agency and self-consciousness to African people. Um, and there's something called historical location. A lot of times, researchers tend to look at Black people, or anybody other than Europeans or European Americans, and say, "Hey, we're going to take. Let's say, let me give you an example. Let's say we're studying um, uh, the the prison industrial complex. If you study the prison industrial complex right now, well, it'll say, well, almost 70% of the people incarcerated are Black men and women. All right. If you leave it there, that doesn't really help to understand what's going on. You have to locate things historically and provide context there, about why that is, about racist laws being passed, Black codes, sharecropping, history of slavery and enslavement, chattel slavery, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All that informs why, up to today, in the period of mass incarceration, you see a whole lot more Black men and women in prisons than you see or other races of people. All right. And it also recognizes the shaping effects of oppression and liberation. All right. So let's talk about some African-centered personality theories and their accompanying assessments. There's a lot more, but I wanted to focus on ones that I thought um, were most germane in this particular topic. So the first and the primary one I'm going to go over is what's called Kanban's theory of African personality. So in this theory, there's two core components. The first one is what's called the African Self-Extension Orientation, or ASCO. And what that is the unconscious portion of your personality. That is innate. You come to the world with this personality, and that's informed by your biology and your genetics. All right, you come to the planet with this, you have this inside you already. The second part of this personality theory is what's called the African self-consciousness, or the ASC. And the ASC is formed by nature and the environment that you are placed in and grow up in. All right. If these two things are if the African subconsciousness develops in an African-centered, rich environment, well, what you're going to get is basic traits, also what we call Africanisms. All right. What you're going to do as a person and as a group is you have a propensity for African survival, all right, and doing things that fortify and help and assist African people. And some of the basic characteristics that you would get from this are, oneness and harmony with nature, communalism, things that we talked about, the group survival, reinforcing Afrocentric beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. So this is in a functional, quote unquote, normal African personality. However, as of right now, Black people, African people around the world are not in a normal setting. Most of us are facing oppression to varying degrees, depending on if you're in the mainland or if you're in the United States, etc. And so this is how it looks. Um, well, this is how it looks if um, you come to the planet with that biogenetic personality, but instead you have an environment that is not conducive to African people. So here's the dual pathways. This black, this is a person. I didn't make this slide. It comes from a book. um, and that blackhead denotes full Africanness, so to speak. All right. So if you have an African-centered space, all right, you do African rituals, African cultural celebrations. There's a presence of African or Black cultural icons. All right, that black head, all right, stays intact. That Black personality stays intact. All right, that develops into what's called a strong ASC, or African self-consciousness. And so you would join together with other Black people and reinforce African nation building and maintenance and African affirmation, positive, pro-Black, pro-African kinds of things. But like I said earlier, that's not the reality for Black people, right? So instead, we come to the planet with this biogenetic kind of personality, but our living space is preoccupied by Eurocentric oppression, right? And so that Black personality starts to lose itself where you're practicing Eurocentric lifestyle rituals, all right? Like if you're celebrating the 4th of July, you wrap yourself with the American flag, right? Your presence of European cultural icons. You think Trump is a great president, right? Um, and you have these anti-African icons out there as well, right? And so slowly but surely, you start to lose that your African self-consciousness, and you have a weak ASC, right? And you go through the world kind of doing and living in an anti-African perspective, culture, and worldview. All right. Um, any thoughts of that before I move on? What do you think of that?
Um, Hi, my name's Crystal. I
Hey,
think,
Crystal.
hey, what's up? What's up, brother? I just want to let you know this came at literally a perfect time because I'm finishing up my proposal. And so what's really important with what you're saying is, for instance, I study how work environments and having autonomy for people of color and where they work is important because culture impacts so much
Mm.
of how we're able to identify ourselves as creatives. And so being able to see this and actually have something I can apply it to in the cultural component of my dissertation is really important. But it makes sense because if an individual has to strip away their culture when they come into an environment, it's really going to make it difficult for them to move autonomously within a space.
Agreed.
Um,
Agreed.
and then we are potentially having people of color essentially regurgitate like hierarchical, like slave based or certain models and so forth on a subconscious level without even realizing that they're doing that. Um, so I think that's why this is so imperative, and most importantly, the sensitivity around language. Um,
Yeah.
for instance, referring back to specifically on the continent of Africa, saying nations versus tribes. The word tribe identifies more as barbaric, so we're subconsciously
Mhm.
creating those oppressive cultural associations because really what's the formation of culture is that oral tradition that's passed down
Oh yeah,
that
and
we've really lost, especially during like Jim Crow and so forth. So I just think this is phenomenal.
yeah, and there's an excellent points. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But on that language part, it's even worse, right? When you don't speak the language of your ancestors, there are ideas and concepts that cannot be translated. There's no transliteration of certain concepts. So you lose perspective and ideas from where your ancestors are from. And those of you who speak multiple languages, unfortunately, I do not kind of know this. There's certain words in languages that don't have they're culturally referred. There's a cultural reference that's not there, and the people wouldn't understand. There's no actual translation for it, right? So there's ideas that we're losing as African people because we have lost our connection to our African culture, right? So we kind of alluded to that, but it's very, 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 very accurate points. Um, all right. Let's talk about some of these assessments. So there's a scale. It's called the African Self-Consciousness Scale. It was created by Dr. Cambone. And there's 4 subscales in this scale. There's collective African identity and self-fortification. There's a resistance against anti-African forces. There's value for African-centered institutions and cultural expressions, and value for African culture. All right. And so here are some predictors of people who have high ASC, which is what you want to have as an African person, right? So predictors of those who are going to have a high ASC is that you go to predominantly African elementary school experiences, right? Your teachers are Black, maybe the children around you are Black. You've been exposed, whether in high school or college, to a Black studies curriculum, all right? Um, you've engaged in some African culturally centered activities in high school or in college, all right? You've had, which probably unfortunately, most of us here have had, some kind of race-oriented socializations and social experiences dealing with racism, like experiencing racial discrimination. Um, if you have feelings of comfort in African settings or culturally centered environments, all right? Some other really background predictors of high ASC is the educational level of your parents, in particular your mother, right? The mom, no, usually, transmits the culture to the child, and so her educational level has a profound effect on the ASC of her children. If your parents are members in Black organizations, that could be the Divine Nine, it could be the NAACP, whatever, right? Lastly, attending an HBCU with a strong pro-African atmosphere. That strong pro-African atmosphere is important because not all HBCUs have a strong pro-African atmosphere. So those are predictors of high ASC. Well, let's talk about if we're using ASC as a predictor of African-centered behavior, right? So if your ASC is high, you probably read more African-centered literature, you participate in African cultural events, you give help individually or organizationally to Black people, other Africans. You have a higher perception of physical attractiveness in African women. All right. We won't see you going out with other races of women. You're probably going to be more physically attracted to African women. There's a resistance to a white supremacy and miseducation. You tend to listen to more conscious hip hop music, and really helpful is that for men, there's lower levels of toxic masculinity, right? Higher levels of self-esteem, lower levels of psychological distress. You know, you get out there, using hard drugs like cocaine and Molly and all this other kind of nonsense that's out there. So if we look at this as a composite, well, we want these things in African people. We want these things in our brothers and sisters, our aunts, our uncles, in the community at large. All right. So another scale, also created by Dr. Cambone, is what's called the cultural misorientation scale. And what cultural misorientation is, I've kind of been alluding to it, is taking on European or Eurasian ideas about the world, incorporating their worldview and their culture into your thoughts, and your behaviors. All right, where you are primarily thinking as a Black person with a white mind. All right, and you're doing everything that's anti-African and everything that is pro-European or pro-Eurasian. All right. So let's get to now that we have sort of a base set up, let's talk about African-centered organizations, all right, and how they differ from European-centered organizations. So here is, all these figures I have not created myself. They're from books. So I'm sorry of the fuzziness about it. But in this structure, this baseline model, there's a traditional U.S. corporate organizational form. And as a tidbit, the first corporations were colonizing expeditions who bought and sold slaves. All right, just keep that in mind. But the traditional U.S. corporate organizational form, all right, is exactly similar to the European American culture. And so the result is a natural blend. If European men and women go into an organization, mostly European men, because there's lots of sexism in European society, but they're right at home. It's hierarchical. There's a perfect kind of blend. they kind of know what to expect. They've been bred for it their entire lives, so it's all good. But if we look at when it comes to African people, well, we have the traditional U.S. corporate organizational form, again expressed as a triangle, and then we have African American culture. Now it's not a triangle; it's a circle. Well, those two don't exactly mesh together, so it's a very difficult blend because there's contradictions between African and African American culture and the traditional U.S. corporate organizational form and design. All right, and so let's first look at some of these basic differences. If we have a European organization, well, we have this very well-known kind of organizational charts. There's hierarchies where who reports to who presides over who works under whom, who's the direct report, who's the person in charge, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now that's been coming down. It's been flattened a lot in the last 20 years or so, but it's still hierarchical. Whereas an Afrocentric organizational chart would look more like working collectives, right? Um, Cooperatives, things of that nature. All right. And so let's talk about some other kinds of real glaring differences between the two types of organizations. And this comes from one of the ancestors that I talked about earlier, Dr. Warfro Kapak. And so she talks about the organizational dimension and what an Afrocentric organization would have as compared to a Eurocentric organization. I won't go over the worldviews, so kind of went over that. Well, maybe a little bit. The cosmology, all right, in an Afrocentric organization is oneness with others. In a European organization, it's control. All right. In fact, if you take anything from this conversation that we've been having, all right, the predominant cultural imperative in European culture is mastery and control over the other. That other could be themselves, it could be another person, it could be nature, but it's control and power over the other. All right. The organizational style in an Afrocentric organization would be support and care for the group, where in the European organization, it's a prime directive and focus for large profits. In fact, it's a fiduciary responsibility. All right. The management in Afrocentric organizations is going to be more communal, whereas European, like I talked about, is going to be more hierarchical. The leadership for an Afrocentric organization is you're going to be selected by your peers, your group. When the European organization is more authoritarian, all right. How is power and authority distributed? Well, in an African-centric organization, it's via council, all right, and it's spread out. Where a European organization, that's still going to be very hierarchical. The decision making in these organizations is, well, in the African perspective, it's going to be a win-win. How do we both win when we are problem solving? Whereas a European organization, it's win-lose. How do I win and you lose? Because we're all competing against each other, right? Whether we work within the organization or if we're game planning, how do we respond to another organization out there? All right. The staff relations are interdependent, but the European one is kind of person to object, like we talked about previously. Productivity is going to be cooperative teams, whereas in European organizations, it tends to be very competitive, which has a lot of drawbacks if we read the research literature. Other researchers have built upon this. And so now they break it up into an Afrocentric organization, an enculturated organization, and what's called a Eurocentric organization. The enculturated organization is African people adapting some of the European ideas for organizational design. I would still consider this to be culturally misinformed. All right. African people should work what would work best with an Afrocentric organization. All right. So We could also talk about what's called the Wells schema of Black organizational experience. So what he talks about is how Blacks are in a predominantly white organization, and then how Blacks are in a predominantly Black organization. All right. So how does authority look if Blacks are in a predominantly white organizations? Well, if you're the authority, well, that's an oxymoron. All right. That's weird. All right. You may not be there for very long because you might have just been hired to be the fall guy. All right. In the leadership, and we've seen this in the literature, right? Your authority can be nullified. All right. Um, Attempts to gain authority could result in what we call microaggressions and aversive levels of racism. All right. Um, and so your coping strategies for dealing with all this is to uphold, aesthetically speaking, the cool factor. Right? If you're in an all-white organization and you're the only Black person, maybe you're a token, maybe there's only a couple of y'all. Well, the prevailing stereotype is that, Black people are cool. So you got this cool kind of aesthetic kind of thing going on. Um, and that's your coping strategy to deal with all the microaggressions and all the weird stuff that's happening to you um, in this particular kind of organizational setup. The kind of core ethical assumptions is that you engage in acts that promote your self-interest. All right. Your self-interest is paramount. Um, and your core values is completing contracts and adding value is the utmost importance. Whereas now I want y'all to think that so all of y'all can probably relate, those of you who worked at predominantly white organizations, to this kind of schema. Now look at what happens when a Black person is in a predominantly Black organization. That could be, a corporation. It could be just a regular organization. All right. The authority person on top is seen as competent and able until they prove otherwise. Right. Authority tends to be elder centric with older people at the top, and they demand respect for tradition. Task competence is secondary to this elder centric kind of setup. You see this in the church a lot as well, right? The social standing, all right, is the medium, right, of exchange and source of organizational cachet, and power, right? How do workers cope in this? Well, to cope, they demonstrate loyalty and respect and deference for elders, and they lower their strivings for for success. All right. What is the behavior like in this kind of organization? Well, behavior is going to be still collective, but utilitarian, right? The greatest good for the greatest number of people. All right. And the core values tends to be perceived as loyal and committed to the collective good. All right. This was a very important slide. What do y'all think about this? Have y'all seen this yourselves in dealing with predominantly white organizations and Black organizations?
Yeah, I've got 20 plus years of this experience, and I suppose this is what has brought me to this path.
Yeah. When I was doing my dissertation, I didn't know this existed, and once I saw it after I became a doctor, I was like, "Oh wow, this would have been really helpful for my dissertation," because I was trying to put this together myself.
It's
But
like
yeah,
it's like you feel and innately know these things. And I think again, the more that I'm learning, the more I'm recognizing, yeah, our spirit note, like again, that Afrocentric, our spirit knows something's not quite right. But what I'm realizing is while I just didn't have the language for it. I
mm,
recognized what was happening, but I just didn't have the language for it, or the understanding that there were a whole host of elders and ancestors that have been doing this work to help educate.
yeah, no,
So
they're out there.
sorry
How
to
am I
jump
doing on
in.
time, Eliza?
Oh, we're at noon. But we do have the Zoom corporate account. So if people are welcome to stay for a little bit longer if they can. I did drop the evaluation form in the chat. But for all means, by all means, continue to have some conversation here for a little bit, and then just wanted to let you guys know that we're at noon and people can jump or stay if they want. We are still recording.
Yeah. So I mean, I have more slides, but I know there's a lot of I know Eliza, you've been looking at the questions, or has there been questions on the meeting chat or
So there were more so comments jumping in and kind of contributing to the discussion.
gotcha.
Talking about Marilyn mentioned, if I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, but being the only Black person within her predominantly white team, she
Mm.
tends to struggle a lot with imposter syndrome due to
Oh
constant
yeah.
microaggressions and the culture. And then Suzette mentioned, being an African living on the being an African living on the African continent. This makes a lot of sense to her.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. So I can go if y'all are cool with it. I mean, I can go over. Oh yeah, go ahead. You're muted.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much
Hello.
for all of this information. I am excited and looking forward to hopefully connecting with you offline. My dissertation, I was obtaining a PhD in international psychology, started traveling the world, became the colonizer that I fight here in the States. So I left my psychology PhD program, and now I'm finishing up my PhD in leadership development with social justice change. But my dissertation focuses specifically on how making the healing profession of psychology, how it's weaponized against Black body individuals,
Mm.
and how by us professionalizing this industry, it actually negatively impacts us more, and we have more healing components within us that has been removed from us due to white psychology. But with that being said, one of the many hats that I wear is I'm a anti-racist case cultural expert, so I testify around the nation as it relates to the negative impacts of transracial adoption. Many of
Mm.
the times I have to explain within the child trafficking industry, also known as child welfare, that these Black body individual babies and children are not going to do well in these white predominantly households and environments. And I have to explain as to the reason why. Many times I have to go against white therapists, white psychologists that are misdiagnosing, that are culturally disrespectful. And with the murder of George Floyd and all of the ethics that have been changed within the American Psychological Association and National Association of Social Workers, one adaptation that they made was that all therapists need to modify each therapeutic component and each therapeutic treatment plan for that culture, for that family. That is not happening at all. Um,
Wow.
and because of that, that continues to destroy my community. So my question to you is, after saying all of that, I actually have a question.
It's all
Um,
good.
is what are your thoughts on how do we move from well-meaning white people to move out of working out of the realm of their expertise, which can actually jeopardize their licensure? So working out of the realm of their expertise means that they're working with Black families, not knowing any of this information, right? Like not understanding any of this,
Yeah.
therefore misdiagnosing and mistreating our community. What are your thoughts on, as professionals in the therapeutic industry, how do we combat that?
So I think you laid out a lot, and I agree with nearly all of it. I tell my students, because one of my favorite movies is Losing Isaiah, and I tell them like Samuel Jackson, how he said to Halle Berry in that movie, "Hey, Black children belong with Black parents," and he was real strong when he said that. And I tell my students that um, for a variety of reasons, right? Obviously, if there's no one available, we want a child to have a home because being a ward of the state has serious negative consequences. I used to be I used to be a group manager of a group home.
Mm,
So I've seen these, young Black men up close who have been, cast away from their families and are living in the ward of the state and how that psychologically messes them up. But to answer your question, um, we need to incorporate in the curriculum of these schools more culturally competent courses. All right. And we need to reinforce that with bridging the gap with this kind of information in these courses. Because you learn about, multiculturalism in the abstract in a more of a general sense. But getting down to kind of the stuff I'm saying here, you don't really touch upon this kind of stuff in a very concrete, kind of concrete way. So we want that. But even more than that, we want to get more culturally competent Africans into those kinds of spaces. I think for the most part, to quell that kind of issue, we need culturally competent African people in these kinds of spots and positions to facilitate and correct some of the wrongs that are being done to our most vulnerable populations of African people. Yeah, that's how I would answer that question. Yeah,
Thank you. We
no
have a
problem.
couple of hands up. So JN, I see you have your hand up, and then Sheila, we can go to you next. But I also want to be respectful of your time, Dr. Flood. Whenever if you
Oh,
have to jump off or anything, please
no,
let me
I'm
know.
here. I'm good. I'm good. So
Okay.
we can answer all
Um,
questions.
all right. So maybe we can give it till 12:30 and then go from there. But right now we have JN and then Sheila, we can go to you next.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. First and foremost, Dr. Flood, thank you so much for this presentation. I look forward to purchasing and reading your book. Ironically, I've been kind of dealing with my own kind of reckoning, of course, with all the social events going around. My parents are also from Haiti. My family's from Haiti. And so trying to really make sense of the world as it is, make sense of the workplace and how we've been conditioned to basically engage. I don't call it assimilation. I would call it cultural erasure in order to really survive in the workplace. So I just want to say I appreciate this discussion. I'm going to quickly brush on 3 points, two of them with a follow-up of two questions. I did really appreciate the discussion of leadership, right? And I conducted a study, I co-authored a study on how BIPOC professionals experience organizational trauma. And there was one particular participant who did share an experience of really seeing that her living in Africa, she found that leaders worked for the benefit of the people that they served, right? There's this form of servant leadership. And she had a significant culture shock when she transitioned to the United States, where now the leaders in an organization that's meant to serve people, they're having to work for the benefit of stockholders and those who, the investors and so on and so forth. And so that just kind of brought me back to that experience. Now, the next two things, one thing I've been trying to also reckon with is seeing those in the Black community throughout the Black diaspora or even in Africa who unfortunately make decisions that are harmful toward fellow Black people. And I don't like to have these conversations in the midst of white people because I don't want the Black on Black crime to become a justification for harm toward us. And so I'm feeling safe with discussing it with family. But you have your Clarence Thomases, you have your Candace Owens, you even have governments, right? Again, my family being from Haiti, and you have leader after leader after leader who works for the benefit of European based or American ideologies, but not necessarily for the benefit of the people. And it causes me to often ask, what did you all have to go through? What trauma did you go through to be convinced that now you have to turn against your own people? And so my question in that regard is, have you done any investigations in the psychology of what, I have my own theories on it. I haven't conducted in-depth research, but I would be interested in knowing if you have done any research and understanding what causes that transition, right? From, for example, someone like Clarence Thomas, who benefited from affirmative action, and he makes a decision that is so harmful to other people. I do believe that while we do need accountability, we also need grace to understand what is feeding those decisions so we can be proactive about not creating this cycle of other people doing that. My second thing is I've also been interested and I've attended trainings on indigenous ideologies and methodologies. And I a lot of alignments, of course, between Black psychology, Black ideologies and methodologies, and indigenous. And when I say indigenous, I'm talking across the world, whether it's Asian, whether it's here on this land, and so on and so forth. And I also find that when research speaks about, for example, collectivism, you're thinking, Hofstede's cultural dimensions. They always speak about that very much in a very other form, right? This is what the Asians do over there. This is what the African Americans do over there, but they don't really speak about it in a form of this is what it teaches us about how we can evolve our workplaces and our cultures here. And so I'm interested in if you have done any studies or any research on the alignments between indigenous methodologies and psychology across the world and how that bridges with African indigenous psychology, as you've been discussing here, and what would be your recommendations of how those can be integrated into our cultures today? So I know I said a lot, but thank you.
It's all good. It's all good. Thank you for your words. So to answer your question, I have not done research on that per se. My research is on the turnover of African people in organizations from an African-centered perspective. However, to answer your question about, let's take for example Clarence Thomas, someone who benefited from things that Black people struggled for decades. Then he just kind of got into his position, married his white wife, and and does everything that he can to help destroy Black people. There is a connection, and this is a working theory of mine. So, but there is a connection between the Black nationalists of the 60s and 70s having very kind of patriarchal, individualistic kind of tendencies, and them sliding into levels of conservatism. All right. So in the 60s, Clarence Thomas, he preached, he was talking that Black nationalist talk, right? And then once the 80s, once the 70s, 80s came in, that wasn't the fad anymore. That wasn't the thing to do. He had some of these connection points with the conservative ideology, and he became a conservative. All right. And so we have to be mindful of our organizations and groups and what they purport. Like even in the Black Panther organization, they did phenomenal things. All right, but there was levels of physical and sexual abuse within the organization. All right, and it wasn't until I think Elise Neal, until she became the chairman, that they started doing things that we kind of associate with the Black Panthers, like the blood, the checking, like for the ambulances, the food drives, the free breakfasts, those kinds of things. And in fact, specifically when it comes to Black organizations, usually there'll be a Black elder man on top for the most part, but the inner workings of the organization, what makes the organization run, is usually Black women. That was true for the UNIA. That's true for most of your churches, right? That's true for SNCC and CORE, all right? All of those were women, kind of Black women, kind of holding the glue together, getting it all together to make things happen. So that's wanted to talk about that. And so how we get to all of this with these kinds of Black people in our societies is, again, like I've stressed, is not connecting Black people, especially Black children, to Black culture. All right. A lot of times, if you say the word African, I grew up in New York when during the 80s, when there was a lot of Africans and Haitians coming into New York because of what was going on. And the kinds of things, I won't repeat it because you're a Haitian, so you already know this. right? The kind of vitriol coming from other Black people
Yeah.
was horrible, right? It was horrible growing up as a kid in the early 80s, right? And I absorbed that, and there was nothing out there that was counteracting this narrative. All right.
Hmm.
There was no cultural events showing just how awesome Haiti was in beating up the French, the Spanish, the British,
Hmm.
the Americans. Like there's a story behind that's awesome, right? Where slaves was like, hey, I'm taking my destiny into my own hands, and if you're not with me, I'm getting rid of you. And we're gonna take back our, we're not gonna be slaves no more.
Right.
But culturally, we don't have the institutions, the structures, the organizations
Yeah.
that are sufficiently African centered, right,
Hmm.
to inculcate and teach the next generation the things that they need in order to be, in order to see themselves as fully African people with a fully African consciousness. And that's what we need to build and start building. That's why one of the reasons why I became an IELTS psychologist.
Mm. Thank you so much.
You're
And
very
I'm Dr.
welcome.
Juliet Nelson, by the way. I don't think I identified myself. Hey,
It's all
y'all.
good. Hey, Dr. Nelson. Any other questions? We could go down the line. I think I got Miss Hudson. You want to ask a question, Miss Hudson, or a statement?
Good morning. I don't know if you can hear me or not.
I can. I can hear
Okay,
you.
thank you. My name is Sheila Hudson, and I am in Louisiana. And I just want to say thank you so much for your presentation. It has actually been very, very insightful. I am a doctoral student. Granted, my PhD is going to be more in higher ed administration. However, I am doing a research study on Black female undergraduates and their need or how they find belonging on predominantly white institutions within the southern to southeastern United States, because I struggled when I attended a regional PWI, and I struggled with finding my identity. Not just as a student, but I was also was offered a job there after I graduated. And so I found myself having to assimilate because some of the colleagues I worked with at that time, they felt uncomfortable with my unique individuality as a Black woman. And whenever I became a older, I realized, why am I telling my students, do what you have to do in order to pass a course that is taught by a white person? You should not have to sacrifice who you are just for a grade. And it angered me to the point where I actually left that institution because I could no longer take what was going on. And I felt that these stories of other Black female undergraduates, they need to be told, because there is a lack of research that talks about how Black females in general find belonging,
Mm.
especially when they are younger. And I do not want a young Black female going through the same thing I went through, living in a predominantly white neighborhood, attending predominantly white schools, and then wondering, who exactly are you when and you don't know. So I just want to say thank you so much for your insight, your information. But I also have a question. Have you or do you know of any studies or research that focuses in more on the stories or understanding of Black female undergraduates, that can shed some light on belonging and finding their true, authentic self when they are coming into a new environment such as college?
So actually, I do. One of my colleagues here at Bethune-Cookman University, Dr. Lane, she does stuff. She's a school psychologist, and her focus is very, very close to what you are discussing right now. If you could send me your email, I could connect you with her. She could probably tell you more about the resources in reference to that. But she works something very, very similar to that. You still
Oh,
there?
thank you so much.
Oh,
I was
yeah.
trying to
Okay.
get off mute. Thank you so much for that. And
Yeah.
again, your presentation, it spoke to me. So thank you.
No problem. Thank you. All right, we go down the list. I got Miss Kessler.
Hi, Dr. Flood.
Hey.
I am a student at University of Maryland and getting ready to be in my final term for IO Psychology Masters. And I think,
Awesome.
thank you. I think one of the things that initially really frustrated me was seeing how when IO Psychology first began, how the publications were just flooded by a bunch of white men about all of the research when it came to IO psychology. And this has come up, like this whole concept or idea has come up in my like training thus far. I kind of had some conflict with a classmate because we were actually introducing to the class how to navigate and manage conflict management.
Mm,
And she was really focused on, oh, you have to take all of the emotion out. That's what the research says, this and that, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, have you examined what intent versus impact? Like you need to acknowledge their emotional experience and what they're going through, like people in general. Like that's how you navigate conflict, like empathetically, like from a place of really truly trying to get to the next level. And I think this also sparked a really deep interest in me as far as the intersectionality of trauma and IO specifically. And I know for a lot of my like white mentors are like, oh, that's not really what IO does. And they kind of
mm,
leave it at that. And I've definitely felt more support in the Black community with that intersectionality of those two, and
yeah.
understandably so. Are there any suggestions on really how to find more of this focused research and like PsyD programs that really kind of embody those two intersectionalities?
So unfortunately, I don't know any that would combine those two areas off the top of my head. Um, but if you're talking about intersectionality, I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Crenshaw and Dr. Bell.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, as far as those, but yeah, no, I agree with you. I think you would find in the literature that I've been going over in this talk, you would find more they don't outwardly say intersectionality, but a lot of this is very intersectional. And so some of these Wells schema and Dr. Cambon's work, I think would benefit you in kind of hopefully bridging the gap with that kind of informational gap.
Yeah, it absolutely did. I added a ton of comments in the chat along the way about it. So thank you so
Awesome.
much for a lot like providing the language and I think the connection I needed with really helping encourage that. Like keep going. So thank you.
Thank you, Miss Kessler. All right, I got Miss Marilyn Michelle Reynolds.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Flood. I appreciate your presentation today. I just finished my first semester of my grad program, which is in IO psychology.
Awesome.
And this has just been so enlightening for me. I currently work at a community college where our president is actually a Black man. We do have several Black people within higher levels. And I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Ralph Proctor and any of his work, but he worked at our organization for a long time as well. However, even with all of, these highly influential Black individuals, the culture of this organization is just still so highly Eurocentric. Do you have my goal is once I finish school, I really do truly want to learn how to change the culture of where I am, so that it is a lot more inclusive for individuals like myself. Do you have any suggestions, anything that I can do while I'm still working through my grad program so that I can start figuring out ways to make that a reality?
So to make a predominantly Black organization, more African centered, or is your
It's
organization
predominantly white, but a lot
predominantly
of
Black?
our higher level. So the president is a Black man. We do have some higher level, people in our cabinet that are Black, but the majority of the cabinet and the board of trustees are white. The majority of the staff, administrators, faculty are white, older. And so it's hard for any type of change because they're not really into the change. And it makes it hard for Black people like myself or, any of the other administrators and staff that I've, connected to since I've been there for the past 6 years. It's not very, it's, it's a very nasty culture. And so I'm trying to
I've
figure
been
out
there.
ways that I can bring some ideas to leadership, and try to put some things out there for change so that it could be a little bit more inclusive and positive for us.
Yeah, so off the top of my head, I have four things. Um, Depending on where you're located in the organization, but normally in organizations of higher education, they're usually either unionized or they have there's a what do you call it? Student like a government association where they all come to all the faculty kind of come together, and students come together and kind of talk about the kind of issues that the organization has and how to remedy them. I would say get very involved with any of those kinds of organizations, those groups in your organization, and try and get into leadership positions so you can facilitate change if possible. Um,
Absolutely. I actually, and I want to make sure I clarify that. I do work in human resources, so I do have a little bit
oh,
of,
well, this would be a
yeah, so I
lot.
wanted to make sure I preface that I do work
Okay.
in human resources. I'm the recruiter for the college. So my goal is to bring in, the talent, but it's hard to try to find that diverse talent when you know what it's like when you get in there. It's not going to be pretty for you. So, um, you know,
Yeah.
it's
So,
hard for me to really do my job in that aspect, but I am in human resources. I did just graduate from our organization's leadership development institute this past May. So I have some, like I've been trying to find my steps into a leadership role so that I could kind of make some moves, but
yeah,
it's harder
no,
than I thought.
no, it's a challenge. Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. So what I would say is I just read a really interesting book. It's called my eyes, it's called The Racial Integration in Corporate America. Um, and that book kind of talks about how corporations kind of facilitated getting more Black and brown people into specifically African people into their organizations. I would recommend picking that book up. I think is a very good read on how to go about doing some of those things. Um, and what I would do is I would change some of the hiring. A lot of times, Black people aren't hired, and you know this in human resources, aren't hired for things that have very little to do with how they would perform on the job itself. All right. There's a lot of biases that go unnoticed, unsaid, unstated. Um, I would also change the training. And now, if I had more time, I had some slides where I talked about how Black people learn and how we could facilitate that and infuse that into our training of Black people, which I find to be very important. My background was largely um, in training, so I'm well aware of those kinds of things. The third would be communications, right? Sending out things to specifically the higher ups that showcase what the organization should look like if it was in the space that you want them to be in. But it's a hard road. Even with, I'm not sure if the person, the Black man on top, if he's more like in this slide right here, if the audition is more like this, but if he is, it's going to be a hard and rocky road to facilitate change in an organization. They got to go through a couple of different things. And I could let me see if I have that slide here. Um, Where is that? So to change kind of organizational worldviews. This comes from a dissertation I read by a woman, a white woman called Catherine Gibson. And she laid out a series of steps on changing organizational worldviews from that of a very Eurocentric organization to a more African-centered organization. Um, and it's first of all, it's going to be personal decolonization. Like Black people are, our minds are colonized. And so we present as a Black person, but we're thinking like a white man, white woman in all we do, unfortunately. Um, the second would be, creating these kind of cross-cultural communications that would help diffuse this kind of information to the organizations, and they can go through their own process of personal decolonization, white and Black, right? Because even though white people are on top with this, they still are negatively affected by racism. Sometimes directly, a lot of times indirectly. Um, and also, the third would be African cultural, incorporating African cultural values and Afrocentric perspective. But that could be one of more of like a multicultural perspective instead of just one that's European centered. Um, and a critical questioning, this was more in the for organizational development, but a critical questioning of any kind of OD values and the inclusion of anti-racism and diversity theories and strategies. I know because of the politicking going on, is that DEI has become a code word for the N word, essentially. But it's still very informative and very helpful. And before it was called DEI, it was just called what it was, affirmative action. Essentially, there's a good history of those connection points. It's not really a new thing, but they don't like any of those. Affirmative action was a code for the N word too. Um, and then just kind of facilitating some kind of indigenous knowledge and approaches to how you go about things. But that points me to something that I want to show y'all. Let's see. There's a lot more I was going to go over with y'all, but they don't have time for that. But in the European worldview, like I said, everything's about control. All right, so this is actually one of my slides that I made. It's kind of decoding things of how all of this is a control grid. So you have education, you have incarceration, and you have the workplace. And there are parallels to all of this. All right. You got a principal, that's the person in charge in the educational space. You got a warden for if you're incarcerated. You got a business owner if you're in the workplace. These are the people who make the decisions. They're usually the white man on top. All right. You got the middle person, the teacher, the correctional officer, the middle manager. Right. They're the first to go if things start going awry. All right, they get a lot of flack. All right, overworked, underpaid. All right. In order to reinforce, we all know about reinforcement, good behavior or things that they want you to do. Get gold stars and praise as a kid. That you love that as a kid. You got a gold star and A++ on your paper. That made you happy, right? If you're incarcerated, you get better treatment by the CEO, get better jobs if you are quote unquote good. In the workplace, if you do a good job, you may get a raise or a promotion, may get praise. All right. In all three of these, you get very little input on decision making. All right, unless you're the person on the top. All right. If you are doing the wrong thing, well, you're going to get detention, which I got a lot as a kid. Unfortunately, if you're incarcerated, you get solitary confinement. The workplace, you got write-ups and termination. All three of these places tend to have dress codes. All right. All three of these places have, you got a school building, a prison building, and back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, you had company towns. You still have some across the world in China and other regions. But company towns is, you live, the company created a town, and you buy things, from the company. They take you on a bus to the workplace, take you back home. Everything is dominated by the company in the company town. They had a lot of those, especially in the 1860s, 1870s during the oil booms. You got a school bus, prison bus, when I used to live in California, you have a company bus that would take you to Microsoft, right? Um, you have bells to indicate when you have to do things or when you have to stop. So we've been conditioned. So when you hear the sound of the bell, you go to the next class, right? Incarcerated. Oh, this is when the doors open. All right, for the cells. All right, and the workplace. If you're in some kind of the automotive plant or manufacturing plant, they tend to have bells, the sounds to tell you when to do things. All three of these places, oddly enough, tell you when you can use the bathroom or not, which is very weird if you're an adult. All right, very weird if you're an adult to have to ask to use the bathroom. All right. All three of these places, you have levels of monitoring, very creepy levels of monitoring, where they're measuring your keystrokes on your on your computer. They can see how long you've been active on the computer by tracking your eye movements, all kinds of stuff. All right, that are not cool. Um, you know, in the current educational system, I don't really call it education. It's really training because they're training you how to be obedient workers under white folks who dominate the society. All right, so it's not really education; it's really training, and that goes all the way up to the doctorate level. That doesn't stop at K through 12. It's still basically training. You get trained for jobs in prison. You get trained for the workplace. All these places have, if you're seeing abridged freedoms, all right. In all these places, right, you got silence and order is emphasized. Workplace, unless you are doing some kind of holding some kind of meeting, you need to be silent, do your work. Incarcerated, hey, don't talk back, I don't hear any lip, silence and order, right? Education, you learn very quickly that the teacher is in control when usually it's a she, when she's talking, shut up and listen. Right? Shut up and listen. All right. In education, you're forced to do things or coerced to do things you don't want to do. Right. Um, there's other ways of educating people, but we don't do that. And the educational system was largely white Western industrialists creating the school system so they could get the right workers. And we haven't left that kind of idea of education. All right. All three of these places exploit the workforce, right? At the college level, if you have labs, well, your intellectual property goes to the school, right? You may have created some kind of invention or some cure, but that goes back to your organization or institution. All right. All three of these places, you have limited communication with the outside world, right? If you pull out your phone, during class, you get it taken away, then your mom has to come and get it for you, right? The same thing with the workplace. They don't want to see you on your phone doing other things. All three of these places are controlled by corporations, either in an obvious sense or an indirect sense. And all three of these places are designed to keep you in debt. It's easy to control people who are in debt. They're not going to rise up. They're not going to change the prevailing forces outside. They're going to go along to get along because they're in debt. So I just thought this was important. I didn't know where to actually put that, but I'm trying to figure it out in my book. Go ahead, MJ.
Dr. Flood, would you mind putting your email in the chat? I would love to schedule a time to connect, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Let me, Dr.
And this was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. I'm trying to figure out how to, let's see. I always forget this.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Dr. Flood, for this amazing presentation. We might have to have a part 2 or something to continue the discussion. But I will drop the evaluation link here in the chat again. I've been clicking all the links that you all have been sharing, and we'll send all of those out with our follow-up email with the recording. And Dr. Flood, if you're wanting to share any resources as well, please let me know and I can include those. But otherwise, thank you all for joining. We're a little bit over, and shameless plug that some of you might have received an email from our chair for about in-person events or networking. So look out for that, but I'll turn it back over.
Yeah,
to you, Dr. Flood, for any closing remarks, and then we'll call it.
Sure. I'm having a problem putting any new information into the chat.
Oh,
So I'm not sure why. But my email address is either it's I can always forget this. Either it's M but from my from Mu-tor, mflood@cookman.edu,
it,
or it's floodm@cookman.edu.
yes,
Oh
I
yeah,
went
I
ahead and
like.
threw it in the chat for them.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Other than that, I'm very thankful to y'all. This is the first time I had a chance to put together a PowerPoint presentation on African-centered IO. So I've been working on this for quite some time, and I thank y'all. I thank you all for the love. I hope this shed light, or more importantly, put words to things that you already knew, which I kind of got from the majority of y'all. You kind of know this already, but it's good to know where to find this information at and what it is, as you can go on with this information. Hopefully, spread it to other like-minded Black folks. Other than that, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Yeah.